Hey everyone, my artistic collaborator and good friend Gitanjali Jain is debuting her first animation, her first short film animation called Prophet as part of Scapegoat Carnival's Soliciting Prophecy film festival. If you are watching this when this video goes out and live, it is tonight, February 15th, 2021. I will post a link in the description box about where you can watch all these beautiful films. I helped Gitanjali with the mix and the sound design on this project. This is Gitanjali's first directorial endeavor and first animation project, and she's got some experience with sound design for theater, but not for animation or film. And so she asked me to assist on the mix and the sound design. The story of the film revolves around a young girl named Lula and her connection and kinship with whales. So a lot of the sound design is rooted in whale songs that we found on various sound websites, including freesound.org and SoundSnap, as well as recordings that Gitanjali had found of whales on Maui, where she used to live. One of the things I did was transformed the whale songs into synth bass patches using Native Instruments form. We're going to look at how I used form, the different patches, and the different ways of transforming these sounds. So let's dive into Logic and look at what I did to these whale songs.
So first we're going to start with a completely stock and blank instance of form so you can all see how it loads up. Of course, form is running inside of Reaktor 6. So we go over here to Reaktor 6, stereo file, and then we double click form ENS to load it. Now the first patch that loads by default is a track called Transformator. And if I play any note, so you see it takes the sample and then gets stuck in this loop. Form is separated into three different parts, three different screens. You have the sample screen, the sound screen, and the effects screen. One thing I find with form and a lot of the Reaktor stuff is that it's very heavy on the effects when you load up the presets, and the first thing I usually do is get rid of a lot of the effects so that I can hear what's going on in the clean sound. So on the sample screen is where you can select your sample. So this is what is cool about form and why I decided to use it for this project, is because you can load any piece of audio up to 30 seconds long, or select a 30-second chunk of any sample that you have, any audio that you have, and then manipulate it and treat it as an oscillator inside of the synth engine. And beyond that, you can also do a lot of different things with the movement and the pitch contour of the oscillator before you even get into the synth or the sound engine. So up here we have the playback modes, mono retrigger or monophonic, mono legato mode, and your glide, and polyphonic. Here is the pitch curve, which is this little graph here. You can turn it on or off if you didn't want the pitch to change, or if you do want the pitch to change. The center is what determines the center chunk of the sample. So if you wanted to move the fragment over, now if I play a note, now it's taking a different chunk of the sample. So if you didn't select the right part when you loaded the sample, you can tweak it from here as well. And you can also change the width. So that's what loads by default. And then here you have the speed at which the sample will play back. And you can change it either via a manual rate in the sample. You can do it by hertz. You can do it linked to your BPM of your host, or you can actually map this scan motion to a controller and move through it completely manually. You have all kinds of different motion curves if you're familiar with the old Massive. I kind of think of this like an envelope, and you can do all kinds of really impressive things with the curve presets. And then you have 4 macros down here: spectrum, sound, motion, and effects, that are all kind of broad stroke ways of changing the sound. Now, in the sound department, or the sound page, this is where it looks like a traditional synthesizer. And you see here, you have your 2 oscillators, your form oscillator, which is your sample, and then your additive oscillator, which is just a basic synth waveform, and you can choose between waveforms here. So you can tune both oscillators. You can change the formant. The formant is basically a vowel sound or a vowel shape, and if you change the formant, for example, if you lower the formant as you raise the pitch, it makes it sound more natural, as opposed to the chipmunk effect when you just speed something up, and vice versa. If you slow something down, you get kind of the Darth Vader, but if you compensate with the formant, you can make it sound more natural. And then you have a formant track selection, which kind of automatically tracks the formant of the original file. You have a flatten pitch selection, which can, if your sample has lots of different variants in the pitch information, you can kind of just make it a single note, so that when you play it across the keyboard, it doesn't change quite as much. So you'll see in this preset, it loads with flatten pitch on. And then if I take it off, I haven't changed the note that I'm playing, but you hear the variance of pitch from the original sample. So this was very useful in working with some of the whale sounds. And then you have pan and amplitude and volume for the second oscillator. You have your envelopes, your LFOs, sidechain, a pretty simple filter that can do low pass, high pass, or notch, and some oscillator effects, including a wave shaper, FM, frequency modulation, the stereo spread, the multiplier, which is kind of like a feedback loop. And then here you have your effects, which is frequency shaping, overdrive or warmth, dynamics or compression, delay, reverb. And you can apply some of these things to one band, both bands. So that's how it loads up. And obviously the reverb, you have a selection of small, large, space, and cheap, and Unreal. I wound up using the Unreal a little bit for the whale sounds, because I wanted this immersive sense of being underwater, and I wanted these sounds to really envelop the listener or the viewer. So I wound up using some of that. I also set up my own external reverb to send everything to. So one preset I used quite a lot as a starting point is a preset called Water Floor, and this is what it sounds like out of the box when nothing changed. Reaktor is a pretty CPU intensive plugin. You'll see that I'm anywhere between 32 and 40% of my CPU, and that's scaling it down to 44.1 kilohertz. It usually loads up at 88.2 or 96. It likes to run at double the sample rate. It isn't usually this high. It's probably because I'm running OBS at the same time, but it's still a pretty intensive synth. and which is why I use Reaktor mostly for recording and not for live use. I find Monarch and anything that runs inside of Reaktor to be very, very CPU intensive. So this was my starting point. Transformator and Waterfloor were my two starting points for the bass synth sounds that I created. Just to clear this up before we dive into the sounds, I do have my tracks running to a reverb bus, which I've disabled for the purposes of tutorial, but in the actual film, I'm running it to Space Designer in the Seashore preset. I definitely, all of this action is happening underwater, so I wanted to really kind of double down on the underwaterness. All three of the tracks are being routed into the send, and what I did was I just automated the level of the reverb for all three of the tracks. You'll see there's some automation on this track. So let's dive into the tracks, the two bass parts and the percussion part. So you'll see that this is based on Transformator. I wound up using that as a starting point because I liked how it went back and forth through the sample. I loaded one of the samples. Gitanjali had sent me all of the whale sounds she was using for the additional sound design. I believe this sample is from a recording made on Maui that Gitanjali found, and it was cleaned up by a sound designer named Devin Bates. So this was the sample that I used, and if I go into the sound and I just take off anything that's happening and I get rid of the additive oscillator, this is what it sounds like with no effects and not a lot of stuff happening in the synth. So you'll see compared to the preset, what's happening is that it's actually moving mostly backwards through the sample. Every time I hit a key, it starts moving backwards through the sample first. It's moving pretty slowly through the sample, only at one, which is actually the default for this patch. And then if I turn the flatten pitch informant track back on and I bring the oscillator back up to about where it was, so you see what I wanted it to be was this kind of low rumble under everything else that was going on, this low sub energy. You'll see I have the Unreal reverb plus my own, plus the Space Designer reverb going. I have a little bit of a delay, and I have warmth and dynamics just to really make a very consistent sub energy happening for this bass part. So if we just play this bass track in isolation, this is what it sounds like. Now moving on to the second bass part, I wanted something basically an octave up in a way that would kind of get the sound to speak on smaller speakers, and also in the image, in the visuals, there are multiple whales swimming with Lula, so I wanted this to be kind of, I didn't want just one bass patch, I wanted multiple things going on. So this is based off of Waterfloor. I think this is another one of the Maui whale samples. And you'll see this time I've actually locked it to the tempo of the cue, and it's at 16th note triplets running through the sample. I still have flattened pitch and formant track on, but you'll see on this I have almost no additive oscillator. So I really didn't want this to feel synthy. I wanted it to be just a way to play the whale sounds as a synth bass, basically, but I didn't want it to feel overtly processed or synthesized. You'll see on this one, because it's higher up, I don't have reverb and I don't have delay. It's a very direct sound. It is running through the Space Designer reverb. I have a little bit of drive, again, just to make it kind of speak on a smaller system. So here's what it sounds like. So you'll see that first part of the whale song, even though it's flattened, it still has a different pitch content, and then it ultimately flattens out. And so here's this whale patch on its own, this whale sound on its own. And now the two whale basses together. Now all of that is very, very low in the mix of the cue. It's under unprocessed whale sounds. It's under Lula's singing. It's under an Udu performance. So again, I wanted it to just have this kind of rumbling textural thing that you couldn't pinpoint what it was. And I wanted it to all come from the whale sounds. The last element of the cue was some sperm whale samples that I turned into percussion, a treble component, a treble accompaniment to everything else that was going on. So when Gitanjali first sent me her mock-up, it was really good, but it was missing some additional low end to me, some kind of rumble. And it was missing some sparkle or high end or some additional interest in the upper register. And she actually planted the idea in my head of making the sperm whales, turning the sperm whales into percussion, because they are such a percussive animal. Their call is such a percussive sound anyway. And this is also based on Waterfloor. I'm doing a little bit more to the pitch curve. I've changed the speed at which this moves through the sample. It's at 8th note triplets instead of 16th triplets. The triplet subdivision is because of what the Udu is playing. You'll see I've taken formant tracking and pitch tracking off because I don't need it. No additive oscillator, or very little additive oscillator, and no reverb, no delay. This is a very percussive, straight sound, and it is running again through the Space Designer just to make everything cohere, but it's not in that massive wash of Reaktor reverb. So here's what it sounds like on its own. And I also used the Brainworks SSL 4000. You'll see I'm scooping basically everything below 120, and I'm cutting the very, very top, like anything above 12K. This is going on YouTube and other digital video platforms, so there's really no reason for the super, super air. I'm compressing it just a tiny bit to kind of make it all speak. And any other EQ moves? Oh, there seems to be a bump here. This is a preset from the Plugin Alliance thing that I tweaked a little bit. There's a high-mid bump at 5K, which is something I do to snare drums just to get them to really kind of pop through the mix. And there seems to be kind of a semi-Pultec thing going on where I'm cutting at 120, but I'm also boosting at 120 just to give it a little bit of body again, but getting rid of all the sub stuff to leave room for my subs. It just brings back some of the details that I felt were getting lost due to all of the processing happening inside of Reaktor, and it just brings back all of the nuance and all of the little micro details in the sample that I thought would be really interesting to have in addition to everything else going on in the cues. And here is all three elements. Here are all three elements together. And I'll just mention the only other processing happening on this cue, on this demo, is a very, very gentle limiter. This is the Softtube Weiss MM1 on the transparent setting. I really like this limiter for very gentle limiting, very clear and transparent, as the parameter says. And what I like about it too is you can mix the original dry signal back in with the limited signal, and you can also dial in the amount. It's a very intuitive limiter, I find, and it's also much more transparent than something like the Waves L1. My favorite limiter is still the FabFilter Pro L. I think it sounds amazing, but for this particular procedure, I went with the Weiss, and so the Weiss has been on the whole time, just kind of clamping down on any peaks, but not really doing very much to the overall sound outside of managing the level.
So I hope that was interesting to you. Some tips and insights into using Native Instruments Form. It's a synth that I've only just started to scratch the surface of, and what I encourage everyone to do with a new piece of software or a new synth or a new piece of music gear is to just explore and try different things and see what you can come up with, either based on presets or starting from scratch, whatever. The joy is in the exploration, and you get to learn these things by just exploring and figuring out what they do and how they work. Deadlines have a way of making me understand something and find the possibilities in something rather quickly. So I appreciate Gitanjali calling me to assist in this and to help out with this. I should mention that this video is not sponsored. It is not sponsored by Native Instruments. I have paid for all of my Native Instruments software. Native is not aware that I'm doing this video, and of course they have not told me what to say. If you enjoy the content on this channel, if you enjoy videos like this, if you want to see more videos like this, click that thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. My analytics tell me that the majority of you are not subscribed to the channel, so please subscribe so that I can let you know when more content is coming out. You can follow me on other social media platforms, including Facebook and Instagram. And if you are able to do so and are feeling particularly generous, you can go over to Patreon and support the channel directly, get access to bonus material and extra content. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.